Miguel was wiping down the tables, his hands moving in a familiar rhythm, clearing the last dishes of the night. He was about to lock up when he heard the restaurant door chime. At this hour, he never expected anyone, especially not a small, wide-eyed girl with tangled hair and thin, worn clothes. She looked barely 8 years old, clutching a small, scruffy backpack against her chest. Miguel's heart sank as he recognized the unmistakable look of hunger in her eyes, a hunger he knew all too well. He took a deep breath, unsure of what to do, but the girl just stood there, shifting nervously from one foot to another. The girl's gaze darted around the empty restaurant, and she took a few steps closer, just enough to show she wasn't planning on leaving. Miguel couldn't help but feel a pang of familiarity. The quiet desperation in her eyes mirrored his own when he was her age. He took a step forward, his voice soft and steady as he spoke. "Can I help you, kid?" he asked, bending down to her eye level. She looked up, hesitating before whispering, "I don't have any money, but if you let me sing here, could I have something to eat?" The question hung in the air, catching Miguel off guard. The word struck Miguel, dragging him back to his own childhood memories of endless, hungry nights on the streets of Caracas. His first instinct was to turn her away. He had been instructed, after all, not to give out free food. His boss, Mr. Ricardo, made it clear that charity wasn't good for business. But something about the girl's soft plea and trembling voice kept him rooted in place. Against his better judgment, he swallowed his doubts and nodded. "All right, kid," he said softly, aware of the risk. "Let's hear you sing." The girl's face lit up with a mixture of relief and gratitude. The little girl took a deep breath and, closing her eyes, began to sing in a voice both haunting and angelic. The delicate notes filled the room, her voice carrying a sorrow and hope far beyond her years. Miguel watched, mesmerized, as her song echoed softly through the empty tables, as if she was pouring her entire soul into each word. He couldn't help but feel a strange ache in his chest, a reminder of the times he had been lost and afraid, just like her. As she continued, he felt something inside him shift, though he couldn't quite name it. Miguel glanced around nervously, aware that Mr. Ricardo could walk in at any moment and catch him in the act. But he couldn't bring himself to stop her, not when her voice was so full of life and longing. The song drew to a close, and silence settled between them. The girl looked up at him with a shy, tentative smile, waiting for his reaction. "Was that okay?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Miguel swallowed, feeling a lump in his throat. "That was beautiful," he managed, his voice filled with sincerity. "What's your name, kid?" The girl hesitated, a flicker of sadness crossing her face as she answered. "Sophia," she said, her voice barely audible. "My mama used to call me Sophie." Her words hit Miguel like a punch. There was something fragile and haunting about the way she spoke of her mother. He took a deep breath, fighting the impulse to ask more, knowing it wasn't his place. "Wait here," he murmured, walking briskly toward the kitchen. He knew his boss wouldn't approve, but he couldn't let her leave empty-handed. His mind raced as he scooped a bowl of pasta, hoping it would be enough. Returning to the table, he placed the warm bowl of pasta and a slice of bread in front of Sophia. Her face lit up, eyes wide with amazement and gratitude as she looked at the meal. "Thank you, mister," she whispered, her voice full of relief and sincerity. Miguel simply nodded, his heart warming as he watched her take a careful first bite, savoring every mouthful as if it were the first real meal she'd had in days. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction, a rare warmth filling the otherwise empty space of the restaurant. But just as Sophia finished her first bite, the door to the restaurant swung open, and the familiar sound of Mr. Ricardo's footsteps echoed sharply through the quiet space. Miguel's heart dropped, his chest tightening with a rush of anxiety. He looked down at Sophia, who froze, her fork hovering midair, her eyes wide with fear. Miguel tried to remain calm, forcing a smile as he whispered, "It'll be okay, kid." But even he didn't believe his own words. He turned, steeling himself to face his boss, praying that he could somehow talk his way out of this. Mr. Ricardo's figure loomed in the doorway, his eyes narrowed as he took in the scene before him. His gaze flickered from Miguel to Sofia, and his expression hardened. Miguel's mind raced, trying to think of an explanation that would appease his boss. He knew he had broken the rules, and he braced himself for the anger he knew was coming. Mr. Ricardo's voice was cold, sharp with disapproval. "Miguel, care to explain what's going on here?" His question hung in the air, and Miguel took a deep breath, readying himself to face the consequences. Miguel's mind raced as he faced Mr. Ricardo's icy stare, his heart pounding with the weight of his decision. He knew that giving food to Sofia was against the rules, and now he had to explain himself. "Sir, I couldn't let her go hungry," he stammered, his voice unsteady but sincere. "She's just a kid." Miguel held his breath, hoping Mr. Ricardo might show a hint of mercy, but the older man's face remained hard, unreadable. Miguel's hands were balled into fists by his sides, his resolve tightening as he awaited his boss's response. Sofia sat quietly, her gaze fixed on her half-eaten bowl of pasta, her small body shrinking under Mr. Ricardo's intense scrutiny. Miguel felt a surge of protectiveness rise within him as he noticed the fear in her eyes, a fear he knew all too well. He could sense that this girl had faced situations beyond her years, battles no child should endure. But in Mr. Ricardo's eyes, it was clear she was just another unwanted intruder, a problem disrupting his neatly controlled world. Miguel swallowed hard, feeling a mix of dread and defiance as he watched his boss glare at her. "Do you know what this place is, Miguel?" Mr. Ricardo's voice was low, barely restrained. "It's a business. We're not here to feed stray kids who wander in off the street." His words hit Miguel like a slap, each one carrying the weight of authority and cold pragmatism. Miguel clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to argue. He understood Mr. Ricardo's point, but couldn't ignore the gnawing guilt that clawed at him when he thought of turning Sofia away. The girl was watching the exchange silently, her small form barely noticeable, but Miguel felt her presence as strongly as his own. Miguel wanted to tell Mr. Ricardo about his own childhood, about the nights he spent shivering on cold, unforgiving streets, hoping someone would care enough to help. But he knew that wouldn't change anything now. Mr. Ricardo had always been a practical man, focused on the numbers, the margins, and the business itself. Miguel took a steadying breath, weighing his options, before speaking again. "I understand, sir," he said quietly, his voice firm. "But I can pay for her meal myself." He looked Mr. Ricardo in the eye, hoping his boss would accept this small act of compassion. Mr. Ricardo's eyes narrowed, as if calculating whether Miguel's gesture was worth allowing. "Fine," he muttered, his voice laced with irritation. "But you pay for it out of your own pocket, and if I catch you breaking protocol again, you're out." The word sent a chill through Miguel, but he nodded, relief flooding him. Sofia looked up at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and confusion. She likely didn't understand the risk Miguel had taken, but her quiet smile told him it had been worth it. Miguel reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing over his thin wallet. As Miguel handed Mr. Ricardo the payment, a strange silence settled between them. Sofia watched with wide, curious eyes, absorbing every detail. Miguel could feel her gaze, like a question unspoken, as if she were trying to understand why he would go to such lengths for her. Mr. Ricardo pocketed the money with a curt nod and left without another word, leaving Miguel and Sofia alone in the quiet of the restaurant. Miguel exhaled, feeling the tension drain from his body as he realized the immediate threat had passed. "Eat up, kid," he said, forcing a smile. Sofia hesitated, her hands still clutching the fork, her eyes darting from her plate to Miguel. "Thank you, mister," she whispered, her voice soft, carrying a depth of gratitude that tugged at Miguel's heart. It was as if she understood, on some level, what he had risked for her. She resumed eating slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a precious gift. Miguel watched her, his mind swirling with questions he couldn't bring himself to ask. Who was this child, and why was she here, alone and hungry, at this hour? The mystery of her situation hung heavy in the air. As Sofia finished her meal, Miguel noticed a hint of sadness in her eyes, as if the warmth of the food had reminded her of something she'd lost. She placed her fork down carefully, looking up at him with a solemn expression. "My mama used to make pasta like this," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Miguel's heart ached at the quiet vulnerability in her words, the way her voice trembled with unspoken memories. He wanted to ask where her mother was, but something stopped him. There was a fragility in her gaze, a silent plea to leave certain questions unasked. Sophia looked down, fidgeting with her backpack strap, and Miguel sensed she was holding something back, a part of herself she wasn't ready to share. He understood that feeling, the need to protect whatever slivers of dignity one had left when the world seemed indifferent. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," he said softly, hoping to offer her some comfort. "But if you ever need someone to listen," his voice trailed off, unsure if his offer meant anything to her. She looked up, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. The silence stretched between them, both weighted and somehow comforting. Sophia's small, hesitant smile returned, and Miguel felt an unexpected warmth in his chest. Just as he was about to speak, the door chimed again, jolting them both. Miguel turned, his body tense, half expecting Mr. Ricardo's return. But instead, a figure stepped in, a tall, shadowed form that filled the doorway, scanning the room. Miguel felt his breath catch as he recognized the face, a face he hadn't seen in years, a face from a past he thought he'd left behind. The figure in the doorway stood still, shrouded in shadows, but Miguel's heart raced as the face came into focus. It was Raul, his estranged brother. The last time Miguel had seen Raul, they were both young, struggling to survive on the streets of Caracas. Raul had left, choosing a different, more dangerous path. Miguel never expected to see him again, especially not here, in this quiet restaurant, where Miguel had finally found a semblance of peace. Raul's expression was guarded, unreadable, but his intense gaze was locked onto Miguel, as if searching for a trace of the brother he'd left behind. Miguel felt a surge of emotions, anger, confusion, even a faint glimmer of relief, as he stood, his hands trembling. Raul took a step forward, his eyes flicking briefly to Sophia, who was watching the scene in wide-eyed silence. "Miguel," Raul's voice was rough, his tone carrying the weight of years gone by. "It's been a long time." Miguel nodded stiffly, his throat tight. He wasn't sure how to feel, what to say. Memories of their shared past flooded back, of the brother who had once been his closest friend, then his biggest disappointment. Miguel took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Yeah, Raul," Miguel replied, his voice laced with caution. "It's been a long time." He glanced nervously at Sophia, unsure of what she was picking up from this tense reunion. Raul's presence felt like a disruption, a reminder of everything Miguel had tried to escape. Raul seemed to notice his discomfort and gave a faint, bitter smile. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, as if reading Miguel's mind. "I'm here for work. Just a delivery." He held up a small package, wrapped tightly, which only made Miguel more suspicious. The tension in the room was palpable. Sophia sat quietly, watching both men with an intensity beyond her years. Miguel could see the curiosity in her eyes, the way she seemed to sense the history between them. He wanted to shield her from whatever dark past Raul carried with him. "You work in this area?" Miguel asked, trying to keep his tone neutral, not wanting Sophia to sense the turmoil swirling within him. Raul's smile faded as he nodded. "Work's work," he muttered, his voice distant. "I go where I'm needed." There was a shadow in Raul's eyes, a hint of something he wasn't saying. Miguel nodded slowly, recognizing the evasive answer. Raul had always been secretive, always hiding more than he revealed. Miguel didn't want to pry, but he couldn't shake the unease growing in his chest. He'd worked hard to build a stable life here, away from the chaos of his past. Raul's sudden appearance felt like a threat to that hard-won peace. He looked over at Sophia, who was still watching with quiet fascination, and felt an overwhelming urge to protect her from whatever Raul might bring into their lives. He clenched his fists, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Raul's gaze softened slightly as he noticed Miguel's protectiveness toward the little girl. "She yours?" Raul asked, a hint of surprise in his voice. Miguel shook his head quickly, though he felt a strange twinge at the question. No. Just helping her out for a bit, he said, his voice guarded. Raul nodded, studying Sophia with a thoughtful expression. She's lucky to have you watching out for her, Raul murmured, almost to himself. Miguel felt a pang of guilt. He had failed to protect his own brother years ago, and yet here was Raul, complimenting him for looking after a stranger. The quiet praise took Miguel by surprise, stirring memories he'd tried to bury. He glanced at Sophia, her innocent gaze reminding him of the trust he'd once had in Raul before life had torn them apart. He forced himself to speak. "Oh, you could stay, if you wanted to," he said, the offer surprising even himself. Raul looked at him, a flicker of longing in his eyes, but he shook his head. "Nah, I've got places to be," he replied, his tone evasive. Miguel felt the familiar sting of rejection, but he hid it behind a mask of indifference. Raul placed the package on the counter, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at Miguel one last time, his gaze softening as if he wanted to say more but didn't know how. "Take care of yourself, Hermano," he said quietly, the term of endearment striking Miguel like a distant echo of their childhood. Before Miguel could respond, Raul turned and walked out the door, disappearing into the night. Miguel stood frozen, grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. He wanted to call Raul back, to bridge the chasm between them, but his pride held him back. Sophia broke the silence, her voice gentle and curious. "Was that your brother?" she asked, her innocent question pulling Miguel back to reality. He nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, his family," he replied, his voice tinged with both warmth and sadness. Sophia looked thoughtful, as if sensing the complexity of his answer. Miguel took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering tension. "Let's get you settled, kid," he said, offering her a reassuring smile. But as he glanced at the package Raul had left behind, he felt a sinking feeling in his stomach, a sense that Raul's visit wasn't over. The package sat ominously on the counter, a quiet reminder of Raul's unexpected visit. Miguel's eyes kept darting back to it as he tried to focus on Sophia, who was watching him with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "What's in it?" she asked softly, her small voice piercing the heavy silence. Miguel hesitated, his instincts warning him to keep her far from anything related to Raul's life. But the package was right there, pulling at him with an invisible force. He had a feeling it wasn't just a simple delivery, and he dreaded the thought of what it might mean for him. Miguel decided to push the package to the back of his mind, at least for now. "It's nothing, kid," he said, forcing a casual smile. "Let's not worry about it." Sophia didn't look convinced, but she nodded, her wide eyes reflecting a mix of trust and worry. Miguel guided her to a booth, gesturing for her to sit. "I'll be right back," he said, grabbing a small blanket from the storage closet. He draped it over her shoulders, hoping to offer her a bit of comfort and warmth. She pulled it tight around herself, her face softening with gratitude. As he watched her settle in, Miguel felt an ache in his chest he hadn't felt in years. There was something about this girl, her vulnerability, her quiet resilience, that stirred emotions he'd long buried. It was as if she reminded him of a part of himself he'd tried to leave behind. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the package, sitting like a silent threat on the counter. Raul's return had shaken something loose in him, bringing back memories of a time when he and Raul only had each other. Miguel felt his resolve weakening, a desire to open the package and understand Raul's intentions. After a few minutes, he couldn't take it anymore. He turned to Sophia, her eyes growing sleepy as she leaned against the booth. "Stay right here, all right?" he said gently. She nodded, her eyelids heavy. Miguel moved to the counter and picked up the package, examining it closely. It was tightly wrapped, with no name or address, just a plain brown box with the weight of something unspoken. His heart pounded as he debated what to do. He knew that Raul's life had taken dark turns, but he had always managed to keep that darkness from spilling into Miguel's world. Until now. Just as Miguel began unwrapping the package, Sophia's soft voice called out to him, snapping him back to reality. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her innocent concern pulling at him. Miguel forced a reassuring smile, tucking the package under the counter. "Yeah, everything's fine," he replied, though he could feel the lie twisting in his gut. He walked back over to her, trying to shake off the lingering dread. "How about you get some rest here tonight?" he suggested, hoping to offer her some comfort. "You look like you could use a good night's sleep." Sophia's face brightened, a look of relief washing over her. "Really?" she whispered, as if afraid it might be a trick. Miguel nodded, smiling. "Yeah, just for tonight," he said, trying to sound casual. "We'll figure things out in the morning." She settled back into the booth, the blanket still wrapped tightly around her, and closed her eyes, a small smile on her face. Miguel felt a swell of protectiveness as he watched her drift off. But as the restaurant grew quiet, his thoughts turned dark again, returning to the package hidden under the counter. Hours passed, and the restaurant was empty except for Miguel and the sleeping girl. The silence felt heavier with each passing minute. Finally, Miguel's curiosity got the better of him. He returned to the counter, his hands trembling as he pulled the package out again. Slowly, he began unwrapping it, his mind racing with possibilities. When he finally opened the box, his heart stopped. Inside was a thick stack of cash, bound tightly with rubber bands, along with a small, handwritten note. Miguel's pulse quickened as he read the words, his mind reeling. The note was brief but chilling, "For old time's sake. Help her, and keep your mouth shut." Miguel stared at the note, his hands shaking as he processed Raul's message. It was clear Raul had left this money for Sophia, though the reasons were unclear. Miguel didn't know if he should be grateful or afraid. This wasn't just a gift, it was a reminder of Raul's presence, a presence that now felt like a shadow over his life. Miguel placed the note back in the box, his mind racing with questions. What had Raul gotten himself into? And why was Sophia involved? As Miguel pondered, he glanced back at Sophia, peacefully asleep in the booth. Her small, delicate form seemed even more fragile under the dim restaurant lights. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was no coincidence, that Raul's sudden reappearance and the little girl's arrival were somehow connected. The thought unsettled him, filling him with a sense of dread. What if Raul's actions put Sophia in danger? Miguel felt a responsibility toward her, a duty he hadn't felt in years, and the thought of failing her filled him with fear. Miguel returned the package to its hiding spot, forcing himself to stay calm. He would protect Sophia, no matter what Raul's intentions were. As he took one last look at her, he silently promised himself he would keep her safe, even if it meant going against his own brother. The night dragged on, and Miguel barely slept, his mind restless with worry. By morning, he was no closer to understanding what he should do, but he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't going to let Raul's shadow haunt this girl's life. And as the first light of dawn crept into the restaurant, Miguel prepared himself for whatever came next. The morning light crept through the restaurant windows, casting soft shadows across the tables. Miguel sat at the counter, his eyes bleary from a restless night. Sophia was still curled up in the booth, wrapped in the blanket he'd given her, her breathing soft and steady. For a moment, Miguel allowed himself to feel a sense of peace, a fragile calm that he knew wouldn't last. The package Raul had left weighed heavily on his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that Raul's appearance, and his cryptic note, was only the beginning of something far more complicated. As he prepared the restaurant for the day, Miguel's mind churned with questions. Why had Raul chosen him? Why Sophia? The cash left in that box was more than Miguel could make in months, and it wasn't money Raul would have come by honestly. He knew his brother had been involved in dangerous things over the years, things Miguel had tried to avoid. The note Raul left was clear, Miguel's job was to protect Sophia, to stay silent, and to accept whatever this strange responsibility was. But he couldn't help but wonder what kind of threat Sophia was running from. As if sensing his turmoil, Sophia woke, blinking in the soft morning light. She sat up slowly, looking around as if unsure of where she was. When her gaze landed on Miguel, a small smile softened her face, a smile that stirred something deep within him. "Good morning," he said softly, trying to keep his voice light. "Did you sleep okay?" Sophia nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Yeah, thank you," she whispered, her gratitude evident in the way she looked at him. Miguel smiled, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety as he watched her. For a few moments, they sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Miguel wanted to ask about her family, to understand what had led her here. But he feared pushing her too soon, afraid that any mention of her past might break the fragile trust they'd built. Instead, he opted for a different approach. "Are you hungry?" he asked, gesturing toward the kitchen. Sophia's eyes lit up, her smile growing a bit wider. Miguel took that as a yes and disappeared into the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast. He hoped the food might help ease whatever burdens she was carrying. When he returned, he set a plate in front of her, watching as she took her first bite, savoring each mouthful as if it were the best meal she'd ever had. As she ate, Miguel couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow. This little girl, so young, was clearly familiar with hardship. "Sophia," he began gently, "do you have anywhere to go?" She hesitated, her fork hovering midair as her eyes dropped to her plate. She seemed to be weighing her words carefully, her small shoulders tense. Finally, she shook her head, a quiet resignation in her gaze. "No, not anymore." Miguel's heart ached at her quiet admission, his protective instincts strengthening. He realized that sending her back out there wasn't an option, not with the shadows that seemed to be trailing her. "You can stay here for now," he said, his voice steady, trying to convey reassurance. Sophia looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Really?" she asked, her voice filled with both hope and disbelief. Miguel nodded, managing a smile. "Just until we figure things out," he replied, though he knew deep down he wouldn't be able to turn her away, no matter what. But even as he spoke, Miguel felt a familiar unease creeping into his mind. Raul's warning echoed in his thoughts, reminding him that Sophia might bring danger with her. He needed answers, and he knew that Sophia might not be the only person to provide them. He resolved to find Raul, to understand exactly what his brother had gotten himself, and, by extension, Sophia and Miguel, into. If he was going to protect this little girl, he had to know what they were facing. But confronting Raul was a risk. He knew his brother's world wasn't one he could easily enter and leave. Later that day, as Sophia sat drawing on the back of an old menu, Miguel pulled out his phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. The voice on the other end was wary, but familiar. "Miguel?" Raul's tone was cautious, as though he'd expected his brother's call but dreaded the conversation. "I need to know what's going on, Raul," Miguel said, his voice sharp, unwilling to play games. "Why did you leave Sophia with me? And why the cash?" There was a brief silence on the line before Raul sighed, a sound laced with regret and exhaustion. She's in trouble, Miguel. "And so am I," Raul admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I didn't know where else to turn. There are people after me, after her too. I can't keep her safe, but you can." Miguel's pulse quickened as Raul's words sank in. This was worse than he'd imagined. "What did you do, Raul?" he asked, his voice low, barely controlled. Raul hesitated, as if debating whether to reveal the truth. "I made some deals I shouldn't have. Thought I could handle it, thought I could protect her. But now they are closing in." Miguel's grip tightened on the phone, a mixture of anger and fear pulsing through him. "And you thought leaving her with me would solve everything," he hissed, frustration seeping into his voice. Raul's voice was barely a whisper when he replied, "You're all I have left, Miguel. She's all I have left." The line went silent, and Miguel knew Raul wasn't going to say more. After a few moments, Raul hung up, leaving Miguel to grapple with the weight of his brother's confession. He glanced over at Sophia, who was still absorbed in her drawing, unaware of the danger that surrounded her. As he put his phone down, Miguel felt a surge of determination. Whatever mess Raul had created, whatever trouble was on its way, Miguel would face it. He wasn't going to let anything happen to Sophia, not now, not ever. The restaurant was empty, the quiet settling around him like a promise. Miguel had made his choice. No matter what lay ahead, he would protect her, even if it meant facing the ghosts of his past. And as he looked at Sophia, he knew he would stand between her and whatever darkness awaited, ready to confront the world Raúl had dragged into their lives. The weight of Raúl's words clung to Miguel, tightening around his heart like a vice. "She's all I have left." Those words haunted him, echoing in his mind as he glanced over at Sophia. The little girl had fallen asleep again, her head resting against the booth with a peaceful innocence Miguel felt determined to protect. The promise he'd made to himself now felt heavier, burdened with his brother's mistakes and whatever dangerous secrets Raúl had pulled into their lives. But it didn't matter, Miguel knew he couldn't turn back now. That evening, Miguel kept the restaurant open later than usual, hoping to distract himself by staying busy. A handful of customers came and went, but his mind remained elsewhere, on the tangled situation he'd been thrust into. Sophia stayed close, watching him quietly from a corner booth. She seemed to sense his unease, her wide eyes flicking from him to the restaurant door as if expecting someone else to walk in. Miguel forced a reassuring smile whenever he looked her way, but he could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface, ready to explode at any moment. The door chimed just as Miguel was cleaning a table, jolting him from his thoughts. A man stepped inside, his movements deliberate, his eyes scanning the room with a sharpness that sent a chill down Miguel's spine. The man looked ordinary enough, dressed in jeans and a leather jacket, but something in his expression, hard, calculating, set Miguel on edge. His instinct screamed at him that this man wasn't here for a meal. Miguel caught Sophia's gaze and subtly nodded toward the kitchen, signaling her to hide. She hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes, but then slipped quietly away. The man's gaze followed Sophia's movement before he shifted his attention back to Miguel. "Evening," the man said, his voice smooth but cold. Miguel forced a neutral expression, trying to keep his pulse steady. "Can I help you?" he replied, keeping his tone casual. The man's eyes narrowed slightly as he approached the counter, hands casually resting in his jacket pockets. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his tone laced with a hint of menace. "A girl, small, dark hair, about yay high." He held his hand up to indicate Sophia's height, his gaze sharp and unwavering. Miguel's stomach twisted as he realized the man was after Sophia. He kept his face neutral, forcing himself to remain calm. "I'm afraid you've got the wrong place," he said, shrugging as if unconcerned. "Just me here." The man's gaze lingered on Miguel, scrutinizing him, clearly unconvinced. He took another step forward, his posture relaxed yet somehow threatening. "You sure about that?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Miguel felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back, but he nodded, holding the man's gaze without flinching. "Pretty sure." The man's mouth twisted into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. "All right then," he said softly, glancing around the empty restaurant one last time. Miguel felt a flicker of hope, thinking the man might leave, but instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled photo. Miguel's heart nearly stopped as he recognized Sophia's face staring up from the worn photograph. "If you see her," the man continued, his voice barely concealing his threat, "you let me know. Got it?" Miguel forced himself to nod, his mind racing, knowing he couldn't risk betraying her. Miguel took a slow breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "Got it," he said, his tone calm despite the anxiety gnawing at him. The man studied him for another tense moment before slipping the photo back into his pocket. He turned to leave, but not before delivering a final, chilling remark. "Tell her she can't hide forever." With that, he exited, the door closing softly behind him. Miguel stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest as he tried to process what had just happened. The danger felt real now, no longer just a shadow, but a force waiting to strike. As soon as the man was out of sight, Miguel hurried into the kitchen, where he found Sophia hiding behind a stack of boxes, her eyes wide with fear. He knelt down beside her, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, he's gone," he whispered, hoping to reassure her even though he didn't feel reassured himself. Sophia looked up at him, her small face pale and tense. "Is he going to come back?" she asked, her voice trembling. Miguel hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "Not if I can help it," he said, his tone firm, though a knot of dread twisted in his stomach. He led Sophia back to the front, glancing nervously at the door, half expecting the man to return. But the restaurant remained empty, quiet, as if nothing had happened. Miguel's mind raced as he considered their options, realizing that staying here might no longer be safe. He needed a plan, a way to protect Sofia from whatever danger Raul's life had brought into hers. The money Raul had left was still hidden beneath the counter, and though Miguel hated the thought of using it, he knew it might be their only way out. Miguel took a deep breath, his decision made. "We're leaving tonight," he said, glancing down at Sofia, who looked up at him with a mixture of surprise and relief. "I know someone a few towns over. She runs a small cafe, and she owes me a favor." Sofia nodded, her trust in him clear despite the fear lingering in her eyes. Miguel knew that he couldn't promise her safety, couldn't guarantee they wouldn't be found. But he was willing to risk everything to protect her, to give her a chance at a life without fear, even if it meant leaving behind everything he'd built. As they packed up a few essentials, Miguel cast one last glance around the restaurant, a bittersweet ache filling him. This place had been his refuge, his fresh start, but it no longer felt safe. He glanced at Sofia, her small figure silhouetted against the fading evening light, and knew he was doing the right thing. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it with her, as long as she was safe. With a final look at the restaurant he had come to call home, Miguel locked the door behind them, feeling the weight of his promise settling heavily on his shoulders. The road stretched before them, dimly lit under the pale glow of streetlights as Miguel and Sofia made their way out of town. Miguel kept a steady pace, holding Sofia's hand tightly as they walked, his senses alert to every sound. Sofia, though quiet, matched his steps, her small fingers clutching his as if drawing strength from him. As they moved further from the restaurant, the night around them grew quieter, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Miguel's mind. He couldn't shake the image of that man, his cold eyes and veiled threats, or the dark path Raul had left for them. After an hour of walking, they reached the bus station. Miguel scanned the quiet surroundings, hoping they hadn't been followed. The terminal was nearly empty at this hour, save for a few passengers waiting in silence. He felt a rush of relief at the sight of the bus schedule. They could be on the road within the hour, headed to a small town a few hours away. The cafe owner he knew there, Marisol, had once been a close friend. She had a way of staying under the radar, and he hoped she'd agree to shelter them, no questions asked. Sofia sat beside him on the bench, her head resting against his arm, her eyes drooping with exhaustion. Miguel looked down, feeling a pang of guilt for dragging her into this uncertain journey. "You okay, kid?" he asked softly, his voice filled with concern. She nodded, giving him a small, reassuring smile. "I'm okay," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Despite her brave front, Miguel could see the fear hiding behind her eyes. He reached into his bag, pulling out a small water bottle and offering it to her. "Drink up. We've got a long way to go." The bus arrived shortly after, and they boarded quickly, taking seats near the back where they could blend into the shadows. Sofia leaned against the window, her eyes wide as she watched the city lights fade into the distance. Miguel watched her in silence, wondering what she was thinking, what memories might be haunting her. He felt a fierce determination to keep her safe, even if it meant leaving everything he'd worked for behind. As the bus rumbled forward, he felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders, but he embraced it, knowing he had made his choice. As the hours passed, Miguel's thoughts drifted back to Raul, to the brother he once knew and the man he'd become. He'd spent years trying to forget the past, trying to distance himself from Raul's dangerous choices. But now, with Sofia beside him, he felt those memories resurface, raw and painful. He remembered the nights they'd spent huddled together, two boys alone on the streets, facing the world together. Raul had always been the risk-taker, the one who'd promised to protect them both. But somewhere along the way, that promise had faded, leaving Miguel alone with scars he'd never healed. Sofia's soft breathing pulled him back to the present. She had fallen asleep, her head resting against the window, her small frame curled up in the seat. Miguel watched her, feeling a wave of protectiveness wash over him. This was no longer just about Raul's mistakes, it was about giving Sofia a chance, a future untouched by the shadows that had chased him and his brother. He leaned back, his eyes heavy with exhaustion but his mind racing. He knew their journey wouldn't end here. There were still threats lurking, but he was willing to face them, one by one. The bus finally pulled into the small town just before dawn, the first light of morning casting a soft glow over the quiet streets. Miguel gently nudged Sofia awake, and she blinked sleepily, rubbing her eyes as she looked around. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "A place called El Rincón," he replied, giving her a reassuring smile. "We're going to see a friend of mine." They stepped off the bus, the cool morning air wrapping around them as they made their way toward Marisol's cafe, which stood at the corner of a quiet street. As they approached, Miguel felt a surge of hope. The cafe was just as he remembered it, a small, cozy place with a faded sign and curtains drawn over the windows. He knocked gently on the door, glancing nervously over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone following them. After a few moments, the door opened, and a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile, appeared. "Miguel?" Marisol's voice was filled with surprise, her gaze flicking between him and Sofia. "It's been years. What brings you here so early?" Miguel took a deep breath, the weight of his decision sinking in. "We need a place to stay, Marisol." "Just for a while," he said, his voice steady but laced with unspoken urgency. Marisol studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she sensed the gravity of his request. Without a word, she stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. Sofia looked up at Miguel, uncertainty in her eyes, but he gave her a reassuring nod, and together they stepped into the warmth of the cafe. Marisol locked the door behind them, a silent promise of safety. Inside, the cafe felt like a sanctuary, its warm lighting and cozy decor providing a stark contrast to the tension that had marked their journey. Marisol led them to a small back room, where a couch and a few blankets lay folded neatly. "You can stay here for as long as you need," she said, her voice soft and understanding. Miguel felt a wave of gratitude, a sense of relief finally washing over him. Sofia looked around the small room, her expression a mix of wonder and exhaustion. Miguel knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Get some rest, kid," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Sofia nodded, her eyes drooping as she curled up on the couch, her small form looking even more fragile in the soft light. Miguel stood, feeling the weight of everything settle within him. He looked over at Marisol, who was watching him with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. Marisol simply nodded, a faint smile on her face. But as they both turned to watch Sofia drift into sleep, Miguel knew that their journey was far from over. The first rays of morning filtered through the cafe windows as Marisol and Miguel sat across from each other at a small table, a steaming mug of coffee between them. Miguel's exhaustion was evident, his eyes heavy with the weight of the last 24 hours. Marisol watched him silently, concern etched into her face. Finally, she broke the silence. "Miguel, what's going on?" she asked softly, her voice steady but gentle. Miguel looked down, running a hand through his hair. He didn't want to drag her into the mess Raul had created, but he knew she deserved to understand the risk. Taking a deep breath, Miguel began to explain, choosing his words carefully. "Sofia, she's Raul's responsibility, or at least, she was," he murmured, his gaze distant. "He got involved with the wrong people, and now she's in danger because of it." Marisol's face softened with understanding, her worry shifting to resolve. "So you're protecting her," she said, a statement rather than a question. Miguel nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle deeply within him. "I couldn't turn her away," he said simply. "She's innocent in all of this." Marisol reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on his. "You're doing the right thing, Miguel. But if you're going up against people Raul got involved with, you're going to need help." Her voice was calm, but there was a fierceness in her gaze that surprised him. Miguel hadn't expected her to be so willing to stand by them. "I can't let you take that risk, Marisol," he replied, shaking his head. But she squeezed his hand, her grip firm. "You don't get to decide that," she said firmly. "Besides, if Sofia's here, It means she's part of this place now. Marisol's kindness brought a wave of gratitude and relief. Miguel felt a flicker of hope that they might actually make it through this. As he looked around the cozy cafe, he realized how much he had missed this sense of belonging. But the nagging dread lingered, reminding him that safety was fleeting. He needed a plan, something that would ensure Sophia's safety long-term, beyond these temporary moments of peace. I don't know what Rules gotten himself into, but these people, whoever they are, seem relentless, he muttered, his voice trailing off. Just then, a noise from the back room interrupted them. Sophia emerged, rubbing her eyes, looking small and vulnerable in the soft morning light. She glanced between Miguel and Marisol, a hint of uncertainty in her expression. Marisol rose, her demeanor softening as she approached the girl. "Good morning, Sophia," she greeted warmly. "Are you hungry?" Sophia hesitated, glancing at Miguel for reassurance, before nodding shyly. "Yeah, I am," she admitted. Miguel smiled, feeling a small surge of relief that she was starting to trust Marisol. Marisol led Sophia to the kitchen, quickly putting together a breakfast that filled the cafe with the warm, comforting smell of freshly baked bread and scrambled eggs. Miguel watched them from a distance, a sense of calm washing over him as he saw Sophia's guarded demeanor slowly melting under Marisol's gentle care. For the first time in days, Miguel felt a sense of stability, a glimpse of what safety could look like for them both. But he knew it wouldn't last forever. He couldn't ignore the fact that Raul's enemies were still out there, searching for Sophia. As Sophia ate, Marisol returned to Miguel, her expression determined. "Miguel, you know I have contacts here, people who don't ask questions but get things done," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his with unwavering resolve. Miguel nodded, understanding the implication. Marisol had always had a way of moving through the world quietly, keeping allies in unexpected places. "I think it's time we found out exactly who's after her," she continued, her voice steady. "If we know who they are, we can keep them away." Miguel hesitated but knew she was right. Together, they came up with a plan. Marisol would reach out to a few trusted connections, people who could quietly gather information about Raul's recent dealings. Miguel would focus on keeping Sophia safe, moving cautiously, and staying hidden until they knew more. It was risky, and it would require time, but Miguel felt a new sense of purpose, a path forward. He glanced over at Sophia, who was now drawing on a napkin, her focus entirely on the little sketches she was making. The innocence of her actions made his heart ache, but it also strengthened his resolve. As the sun rose higher, bathing the cafe in warm light, Miguel felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe they could do this. Maybe they could stay one step ahead and find a way to free Sophia from the shadows of Raul's mistakes. Marisol's faith bolstered him, reminding him of the resilience he'd once had, the courage he thought he'd lost. For the first time in a long time, Miguel felt like he wasn't alone in facing the challenges ahead. With Marisol's support, he was prepared to do whatever it took to protect Sophia and give her a chance at a real future. The cafe was calm, a quiet morning routine settling around them, but Miguel's mind buzzed with the weight of their plan. Marisol had left to speak with her contacts, promising she'd return with information by nightfall. Until then, Miguel and Sophia would stay hidden, making sure no one saw them. He watched Sophia as she drew, her small fingers creating a series of intricate lines across a napkin, her face deeply concentrated. Every now and then, she glanced up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and lingering fear that Miguel wished he could erase. Miguel wanted to keep her distracted, to give her a few hours of normalcy. "What are you drawing, kid?" he asked softly, leaning over to see her creation. Sophia hesitated, then held up the napkin to show him. It was a small drawing of a house, surrounded by trees, with two stick figures standing in front, a larger one with a wide, protective stance and a smaller one beside it. Miguel felt a pang in his chest, realizing it was her way of drawing herself with him. "That's us, heh?" he asked, a soft smile spreading across his face. She nodded, her eyes warming slightly. Just then, the cafe door opened, and Miguel's heart skipped a beat. He instinctively pulled Sophia closer, but his shoulders relaxed as Marisol walked in, her expression both determined and cautious. She gestured for him to follow her to the back room, and he left Sophia with a reassuring squeeze of her hand. Once in the small, dimly lit room, Marisol closed the door and turned to him, her gaze serious. "I found out who's after her," she said in a low voice. "Raúl got involved with a gang, a dangerous one. They're relentless, Miguel, and they have eyes everywhere." Miguel's pulse quickened as he took in her words. "Do they know she's here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Marisol shook her head. "Not yet. But it won't take long for them to connect the dots if they know Raúl left her with you." She looked at him, a flash of regret in her eyes. "They're not just after her for leverage, Miguel. They believe she's the key to finding Raúl. If they find her, they'll stop at nothing to get to him." Miguel's stomach twisted, the weight of their situation settling heavily on him. He knew he had to make a choice, and fast. Miguel clenched his fists, the resolve in his heart growing stronger. "We have to get her out of here. Somewhere safe, far from anyone who might know her or Raúl," he said, his voice filled with urgency. Marisol nodded, her face set with determination. "I know someone who can help with new identities," she replied quietly. "It's risky, but it might be our only option." Miguel felt a surge of hope, though he knew it came with its own risks. He'd be abandoning his life, everything he'd built, but he couldn't let fear stop him, not when Sophia's safety was on the line. They returned to the main room, where Sophia was sitting quietly, her drawing folded neatly in her lap. She looked up at them, sensing the seriousness in their expressions. Miguel knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sophia, we're going to go on another trip," he said softly. Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded, her trust in him unwavering. Miguel felt a lump form in his throat at her quiet bravery, at how easily she placed her faith in him despite everything. "It'll be okay," he added, forcing a smile. "We're going somewhere safe." As they gathered their things, Marisol handed Miguel a small slip of paper with an address on it. "Go here," she instructed. "The man there can get you what you need, but you'll have to keep moving afterward. It's a temporary solution, but it'll buy you some time." Miguel nodded, grateful beyond words for her help. Marisol placed a hand on his arm, her gaze softening. "You're doing a good thing, Miguel. You're giving her a chance." Miguel managed a nod, his gratitude for Marisol's support overwhelming him. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. They left through the cafe's back entrance, slipping into the narrow alleys that wound through the town, keeping to the shadows. Miguel held Sophia's hand tightly, guiding her with quiet reassurance as they made their way toward the address Marisol had given him. The city felt unfamiliar and cold, its streets lined with strangers who might unknowingly lead danger right to them. Miguel's heart pounded as they walked, his senses alert to every sound, every flicker of movement. He couldn't afford any mistakes now. Each step took them closer to safety, or so he hoped. They arrived at a small, unassuming building, its exterior worn and faded. Miguel hesitated, glancing down at Sophia, who looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. He knocked on the door, and after a moment, it creaked open, revealing a man in his 60s with a hard but kind expression. "You must be Miguel," the man said, his voice low and steady. Miguel nodded, his grip on Sophia's hand tightening. "And this is Sophia?" The man's gaze softened as he looked at her, his voice gentler. "You've got nothing to worry about here. Let's get you two sorted." Miguel felt a wave of relief wash over him as they stepped inside, feeling the walls of protection closing around them. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that they might have a real chance. The man explained the process, detailing the papers, the new names, the new life that awaited them. Miguel listened intently, every word a thread of hope weaving into a new beginning. As the man worked, Miguel looked over at Sophia, whose eyes sparkled with a mix of curiosity and relief. She seemed to sense, in her own quiet way, that this was the start of something better. When it was finally done, Miguel looked at the documents, the names that would now be theirs. He felt a strange sense of finality, as though he were burying a part of his past. But he knew this was the only way. With these new identities, they could slip away, vanish from the eyes that sought them. As he tucked the papers into his jacket, he knelt down beside Sophia, looking her in the eye. "We're going to be okay, kid," he whispered, his voice filled with a newfound conviction. And as they stepped out into the night, Miguel felt a spark of hope, bright and undeniable. The evening air was crisp as Miguel and Sophia stepped out, their new identities tucked safely in Miguel's jacket. For the first time in days, Miguel felt the faintest flicker of peace, as if they truly slipped away from the shadows Raúl's life had cast over them. Sophia's small hand rested in his, her gaze forward, and though she was quiet, Miguel sensed a calmness in her he hadn't seen before. They walked through the unfamiliar streets, the reality of their new lives sinking in, bringing with it both hope and an ache for the people they'd left behind. They boarded a late bus that would carry them far away, toward a place neither of them had ever been. Miguel chose seats near the back, where they could fade into the background and let the journey carry them away from danger. Sophia nestled into the seat beside him, her head resting against his arm. Miguel watched her, feeling the depth of his promise settle within him, a commitment to protect her, to give her the life she deserved, no matter the cost. He felt a surge of gratitude for Marisol and everyone who had silently supported them, even without fully understanding their burden. As the bus rumbled on, Miguel's thoughts drifted back to Raúl. He hadn't wanted things to end this way, with a chasm of secrets and danger separating them. Raúl had once been his protector, his closest friend, and Miguel couldn't help but feel the sting of that loss. He hoped, somewhere deep down, that Raúl would find his own path out of the darkness, though he knew that path was treacherous and uncertain. Miguel's only consolation was that he had kept Sophia safe, that he had done what Raúl had asked. In his heart, he knew Raúl had chosen this for her, too. Hours passed, the landscape changing outside the bus window, each mile carrying them further from the life Miguel had built and left behind. Sophia slept peacefully beside him, her breath steady, her small face serene. Miguel marveled at her resilience, her quiet strength. She had faced so much, yet here she was, embracing the unknown with a trust that inspired him. He realized that in protecting her, he'd found a purpose he hadn't known he was searching for. Her presence had reignited something within him, a determination to live, not just survive, for both of their sakes. As dawn broke, the first light of morning casting a soft glow over the landscape, Miguel felt a strange sense of renewal. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one free of the shadows Raúl had cast over their lives. He didn't know what awaited them in this unfamiliar town, but he knew that as long as they stayed together, they could make it through. He glanced down at Sophia, who was beginning to stir, blinking sleepily as she took in the new scenery. She looked up at him with a small smile, and in that moment, Miguel felt the weight of his promise lift, replaced by a fierce resolve. When the bus finally came to a stop, Miguel and Sophia stepped off, the fresh air filling their lungs as they looked around. The town was small and quiet, nestled between rolling hills, a place far removed from the chaos they'd left behind. Miguel took a deep breath, feeling the peace of this place settle within him. "Well, here we are," he said softly, glancing down at Sophia. She looked around, her eyes wide with wonder, taking in the newness of it all. There was a lightness in her gaze, a sense of possibility that mirrored his own. They found a modest motel nearby, and as they unpacked what little they had, Miguel felt a rare sense of contentment. They didn't need much. All that mattered was their safety, their chance to start fresh. Sophia looked at him as they settled in, her expression a mixture of gratitude and affection that warmed him deeply. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice small but filled with sincerity. Miguel's heart swelled, and he knelt beside her, meeting her gaze. "You don't have to thank me, kid. We're family now, okay?" She nodded, a quiet smile spreading across her face. Days passed, each one bringing them closer to a routine, to a life they could call their own. Miguel found work at a local grocery store, the kind of simple, honest job that allowed him to blend in, to build a foundation for their future. He made friends with his co-workers, keeping their lives private but embracing the sense of community he'd missed. Sophia began school, her shyness gradually melting as she made friends, her laughter filling their small home in a way that made Miguel's heart soar. They shared simple dinners, conversations filled with warmth and hope. Months went by, and the specter of Raúl's world slowly faded into the background. Though Miguel knew the risk was never truly gone, he felt a sense of safety in this new life, a resilience built on each passing day. Sophia blossomed, her once guarded demeanor softening as she embraced her new surroundings. Miguel often caught her laughing with friends, her face bright with joy, and he knew he had made the right choice. He had given her the life Raúl had wanted for her, a life far from the fear and uncertainty that had once defined her. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Sophia looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Miguel looked into the distance, feeling the familiar ache of loss, of the brother he'd loved and lost. "I don't know," he replied honestly, his voice carrying a mix of hope and acceptance. "But wherever he is, I think he knows you're safe. And I think that's what matters most to him." Sophia nodded, seeming content with that answer. As the night settled around them, Miguel felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet certainty that they had found a place they could call home. He looked at Sophia, her small hand resting in his, her gaze peaceful as she leaned against him. For the first time in years, Miguel allowed himself to believe in a future unmarked by shadows. And as they sat together under the endless sky, he knew he'd keep his promise to her, to protect her, to give her the life she deserved, and to face whatever came their way, together. If you like this story, take the opportunity to see the others that are appearing on your screen right now. Subscribe to the channel and comment on what you thought of this story. See you soon, bye.